9.4. The nature of Roman slavery. In Roman Slavery and Society, Keith R. Bradley makes clear something that should always be recognized when studying Roman slavery: its enormous diversity and variability. He stresses that any attempt to seek general features must constantly allow for the unanticipated and the exceptional. Numbers and origins. Many scholars have attempted to estimate the percentage of slaves in Roman society, but any numbers mentioned with regards to the ancient world must be suspect. It is almost impossible to put an accurate figure on the number of slaves in Rome and Italy, and particularly in the provinces of the empire, as conditions differed from time to time and from one place to another. Most agree that it could have been somewhere between 10 to 30% of the total population. The table below shows one estimate of slave numbers. Rome had around 30 to 350,000 slaves in Rome out of a population of 900,000 to 950,000. Italy, around 2 million out of a population of 6 million. And the provinces, based on conjecture from isolated provinces, probably about 16 to 20% of the population. Apart from conquest, the practice of kidnapping by bandits and pirates also contributed to slave numbers, but their activities had been severely curtailed, though not entirely eradicated, by the Roman government. There came a point when these methods would no longer fill the shortfall of slaves needed for running Roman society. So, what other sources of slaves were there? The second century Roman jurist Gaius, in his Institutiones, said, "Slavery is a human invention and not found in nature. Indeed, it was that other human intervention, war, which provided the bulk of slaves. But there was also the bounty of piracy or the product of breeding." John Madden, in Slavery in the Roman Empire, Numbers and Origins, wrote, "We must turn our attention to other sources of slaves in the early centuries of the empire. Some have taken the view that since the slave body at this time was already very great, the bulk of the new slaves required each year would have been provided from their own class, i.e., that the slave body would have been almost self-propagating. Vernae, slaves born at home and kept within the family, familiar in Roman law, any infant born to a slave woman was in turn a slave, are certainly mentioned frequently in our sources. They were normally preferred by the Romans, who tended to get on well with them. Their background was known, they spoke Latin from the beginning, and they were accustomed to slavery, and could be taught whatever skill their master intended for them. However, slaves born and kept at home could not have provided for the annual requirements for new slaves, because the evidence suggests, records of wealthy families and indications from literature, that domestic staff were predominantly male, just as they were in those occupations where the work was difficult, such as mining and building. Granting slaves their freedom, or manumission, made it difficult for the slave population to propagate itself, and it seems that marriageable females were more often manumitted. So how were the slave numbers maintained? Until 374 CE, when it was made illegal, the abandonment of infants was widespread over much of the Roman world, and no doubt occurred more frequently whenever circumstances became especially difficult. The practice of child exposure was particularly prevalent in the Roman provinces of Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, and Bithynia Pontus. Some abandoned children were found inadvertently and either kept or sold on, while it appears that there were those in the slave trade who made them available on request. Baby farming of both sexes appears to have been common in Egypt, where foundlings were collected from what one Egyptian legal papyrus called the dung pile for enslavement. In a letter to his wife, an Egyptian husband advises her, "If you do give birth, if it is male, let it live. If it is female, cast it out." These abandoned babies may have been raised by wet nurses in expectation of a later sale. Buying and selling of slaves. During the Republican Wars of Conquest, slaves were usually purchased wholesale by dealers who followed the armies. Julius Caesar is believed to have once sold 53,000 Gauls, an entire community, on the spot to a dealer, but there were slave markets all over the Roman world. Apart from those in Rome, the two main venues for slave auctions were the free port of Delos in the Aegean and at Ephesus on the coast of Asia Minor. While most slaves were sold at auction, some were sold in shops and others sold privately, especially if the slave trade was regarded as valuable property, perhaps a highly educated Greek. Source 9.13 records one such private deal done in Egypt. "I acknowledge that I have sold to you from now on in perpetuity the female slaves that I own, who is at present 3 years old, honey complexioned, at a price agreed between us of 30 to 90 talents of silver, which I have received in hand full here, in return for which she will remain with you, and you will have control and ownership of the purchased goods and the right to supervise and manage her however you like. I guarantee this in perpetuity." Slaves were generally presented to prospective buyers naked, as the purchaser wanted to see exactly what he was getting. Seneca wrote that buyers often examined and felt every part of a naked woman for sale, but it wasn't just women who were the objects of these physical examinations, known as catasta. It was as though the slave were an animal, an ox, a cow, or a mule, that had to be put through its paces before a deal could be made. Slaves also wore a sign hanging around their necks indicating their origin, health, character, intelligence, education, and other pertinent information. Prices varied accordingly. By the time of Augustus, there was a 2% tax on the sale of slaves, which apparently added 25,000 sesterces annually to the imperial coffers. This was increased in 43 CE to 4%. These auctions were overseen by Roman officials. Most slaves were sold with a buyback guarantee within 6 months, if, for some reason, there were defects that were not obvious at the time of sale. Slaves at auction wearing a cap were sold with no guarantee. Occasionally, the seller of a female slave attached a ne serva clause to the ownership papers. This meant that she could not be prostituted, and if any owner in the future used her as a prostitute, she could be freed. Digest 21.1 Ulpian, on the Edict of the Curial Aediles, wrote, "The Aediles declare that those who sell slaves should make the buyers aware of each's disease and defects, which are runaways, which are truants, and which are subject to a claim for damage. They should announce all of this openly and plainly when they sell the slaves. If a slave turns out otherwise, or things turn out differently from what was said and promised when the sale was being made, we will pronounce as to what is owed in respect of the slave, and we will allow court action for the return of the slave to the buyer." The roles and status of slave groups within Roman society. Slaves were used in all parts of Roman life except in positions of elected public office. There were roughly five major categories of slaves depending on their occupations, but within each occupation there would be a hierarchy of status. Rome, Romans seem to have a fixation with categorization and hierarchy. Household slaves. Epitaphs have recorded at least 55 jobs a household slave might have, and all domestic slaves were under the power of the master and at his constant disposal. Some households had just a few slaves, while very wealthy Romans kept hundreds of slaves as a means of display or for their show value. Seneca records that one went so far as to pay 100,000 sesterces for each for slaves to remind him of names and quotations from literature and poetry. Calvisius Sabinus, the millionaire, brought slaves at great expense, one to recall Homer and another to recall Hesiod, and he assigned one to each of the lyric poets. A large elite household in town or in the countryside might employ hundreds of slaves covering jobs such as managing businesses outside the home and buying supplies or procurator, managing the house, anatriensis, controlling supplies and their storage, a dispensator, disciplining the slaves and keeping the home quiet, a silenarius. S. M. Treghiari, in his work Domestic Staff at Rome during the Julio-Claudian period, makes a list of all these those domestic slaves mentioned in the record that might have been employed in a well-to-do and elite household. Although there were others in lowly positions, such as those who attended to fires, toilets, and cleaning, the living standards of household slaves, though simple, a small cell, a thin mat, and an old blanket, were often superior to that of many free urban poor in Rome. Table 9.3 discusses the jobs of domestic slaves in a wealthy Roman household, compiled by Epitaphs. A servant in charge of screening guests, a front doorman, litter bearers, architect, chaser, physicians and surgeon, chefs, cooks and dairymen, butlers, food tasters, dining room supervisors and waiters, tutors and readers, servant in charge of bedroom, handmaids, a masseur, barbers and hairdressers, foot washers, cupbearers, occultists, wet nurses and nursery attendants, spinner, clothes mender, male, glacier, servant in charge of windows, servant in charge of statues, a secretary accountant and cashier, male, musicians, male and female singers, comic actor, dwarves, jesters, weaver, male, gardener, male tailors, seamstresses, marble cutter, fuller, servant in charge of pictures and busts, and a gilder. Urban crafts and services. Slave industry could be either skilled or unskilled. Some masters allowed their slaves to set up a business on their own. In urban workplaces, slaves might be employed as launderers, engravers, shoemakers, bakers, mule drivers, or baggage porters, to unload and load boats, and could be found pulling barges by rope upstream and downstream on rivers. In the construction industry, on the docks, and on road making projects, in public baths as entertainers, and even to perform tasks in certain cult rituals as prostitutes and gladiators. In agriculture, very large estates were generally owned by absentee landowners who lived and worked in Rome, such as Cato the Elder and Pliny the Younger. The workforce on large agricultural properties producing grain, cattle, wine, and olives were mostly slaves managed by an overseer or a villicus, who was often a slave himself. For many, their lot was miserable, as they were usually housed in barrack buildings, ergastula, in poor prison-like conditions, and some worked in chain gangs. Their lives were usually short. As well as those who worked in the household of the country villa, there were slaves categorized as fowlers, ploughmen, ditchers, shepherds, herdsmen, foresters, trackers, muleteers, and water carriers. These rustici were regarded inferior to urbani. Mining and quarrying. These were public slaves known as damniti in metellum, those condemned to work in the mines, who numbered in their tens of thousands, were forced to work in the gold and silver mine and marble quarries. They suffered notoriously brutal conditions and treatment, and their status under law was different from that of other slaves. They could not buy their freedom, be sold, or set free. They were expected to live and die in the mines. Public or imperial service. A servus publicus was a slave A servus publicus was a slave owned not by a private individual but by the state. Some worked in temples, doing basic tasks such as servants of the various priesthoods, in public buildings in Rome and municipalities as accountants and secretaries for magistrates and other officials, on government building programs, on maintaining the aqueduct system, and for a time protecting the city from fire. Imperial slaves were attached to the emperor's household, the familia Caesarius. Treatment of slaves. The treatment of slaves varied according to the attitude of their owners and to the particular slave's status within society. There was certainly much abuse, but there were also masters who treated their slaves reasonably well. For example, there seems to have been a stronger obligation to care for verni, or those slaves born within a household, since some of them may have been children of the free males within that household. However, slaves were often regarded as property and generally treated as such. The written sources present a range of attitudes towards slaves, and some of these have been highlighted already. Below are further examples of the type of treatment meted out to slaves. The Roman playwright Plautus, writing his comedies about the end of the Second Punic War, gives a picture of an inconsiderate master, Ballio, and kind of treatment his slaves were likely to get. Ballio, come out! Get out! Come out with you, you rascals, kept at a loss and brought at a loss. Not one of you dreams minding your business or being a bit of use to me, unless I carry on thus. He strikes his whip around on all of them. Never did I see men more like asses than you. Why, your ribs are hardened with the stripes. If one flogs you, he hurts himself the most. Aside, regular whipping posts are they all, and all they do is pilfer, purloin, prig, plunder, drink, eat, and abscond. Oh, they look decent enough, but they're cheats on their conduct. Addressing the slaves again. Now, unless you're all attention, unless you get that sloth and drowsiness out of your breasts and eyes, I'll have your sides so thoroughly marked with thongs that you'll outlive those Campanian coverlets in colour or a regular Alexandrian tapestry, purple browed all over your all over with beasts. Yesterday I gave each of you his special job, but you're so worthless, neglectful, stubborn, that I must remind you with a good beating. Cato the Elder, who lived in the 2nd century BCE, was a harsh statesman who was the most persistent advocate for the total destruction of Carthage, and is remembered for his repetitive statement, Delenda est Carthagio, or Carthage must be destroyed, every time he rose to speak in the Senate. He was also the owner of a large agricultural property and many slaves. His manual on agriculture and animal husbandry, De Agricultura, or on the agriculture, in- includes suggestions on how to manage farm slaves and what rations they should receive in summer and winter. Although he did not advocate deliberate cruelty, his impersonal attitude was to treat his slaves according to cold regulations like so many expensive cattle. He gave advice on keeping slaves continually at work or reducing rations when they were sick, and recommending that old and sick slaves should be expelled from his house. Plutarch, in his Life of Cato, added further comments about Cato's treatment of slaves. He used to entertain his friends and colleagues at table. No sooner was the dinner over than he would flog those slaves who had been remiss at all in preparing or serving it. He was also always contriving that his slaves should have feuds and dissensions among themselves. Harmony among them made him suspicious and fearful of them. He had those who were suspect of some capital offence brought to trial before all their fellow servants, and if convicted, put to death. Diodorus Siculus, or Diodorus of Sicily, was a Greek historian who lived between 90 and 30 BCE. He is known for his accounts of the first two slave revolts that occurred in Sicily at the end of the 2nd century BCE. In the following source, he gives some information on the treatment of slaves employed in the mines. But to continue with the mines, the slaves who were engaged in the working of them produced for their masters revenues in sums defying belief. But they themselves wear out their bodies both by day and by night in the diggings under the earth, dying in large numbers because of the exceptional hardships they endure. But no respite or pause is granted them in their labours, but compelled below blows of the overseers to endure the severity of their plight. They throw away their lives in this wretched manner, although certain of them who can endure it by virtue of their bodily strength and their persevering souls suffer such hardship over a long period. Indeed, death in their eyes is more desirable than life. Columella was the most important writer on the agriculture of the Roman Empire. After a career in the army, he turned to farming, and in his Res Rustica, in 12 volumes, provides information on rural slavery, the qualities needed in slaves, and particularly their slave overseers, and the best form of treatment. Nowadays I make it a practice to call them, his rural slaves, into consultation on any new work, as if they were more experienced, and to discover by this means what sort of ability is possessed by each of them and how intelligent he is. Furthermore, I observe that they are more willing to set about their piece of work on which they think their opinions have been asked and their advice followed. Again, it is the established customs of all men of caution to inspect the inmates of the workhouse, to find out whether they are carefully chained, whether the places of confinement are quite safe and properly guarded, whether the overseer has put anyone in fetters or removed his shackles without the master's knowledge. For the overseer should be most observant in both points, not to release from shackles anyone whom the head of the house has subjected to that kind of punishment, except by his leave, and not to free one who himself has chained on his own initiative until the master knows the circumstances. Punishments. Due to the frequency of runaways mentioned in the sources, it seems like many were badly treated. Romans were forbidden from harbouring fugitive slaves, and if anyone with malice aforethought shall be declared to have sheltered another slave, male or female, the praetor made a judgment against such a person at double the value of the cost of the damage. Advertisements were posted with precise descriptions of escaped slaves, rewards offered, and professional slave catchers were hired to hunt down runaways. A reward is available to anyone who finds X, an Egyptian from the home of Athrabetes, who does not know Greek, and is tall, thin, bald-headed, with a scar on the left side of his head, of olive complexion, jaundiced, thinly bearded, and having no hair at all on his chin. Smooth-skinned, narrow-jawed, with a long nose, a weaver by trade, who walks around like he's somebody, rambling on a high-pitched voice. He is about 32 years old. He is wearing a brightly coloured cloak. If a fugitive is caught, he or she could be flogged, fitted with an inscribed metal collar around the neck describing his or her misdemeanor, or branded on the forehead with the letters FUG, or for fugitives. Grab me, I'm a runaway. I'm an adulterous whore. Grab me, I'm a runaway from Bulla Regia. Grab me, I'm a runaway, and recall me to my master, the eminent Senator Carthages, at the Libanian market in the third region of Rome. I fled, hold me, bring me to my master Zonino, who will receive a solidus. Grab me, I'm a runaway, and recall me to Victor, the acolyte at the church of St. Clemens. Punishments for more serious crimes include putting in chains, torturing, imprisoning, forced to become a gladiator, and crucifixion. In certain places in Italy, there was a contracting service for the punishment of slaves. This was carried out by those who removed dead bodies from the city and conducted public funerals. They inflicted torture or capital punishment on behalf of the owners or at the command of the magistrates. If someone wants to inflict punishment on a male or female slave privately, he will get the punishment inflicted according to his wishes. If he wants to affix the slaves to a cross or gibbet, the contractor should provide planks, chains, and ropes for the whipman, and provide the whipman. Whenever the magistrates inflict punishment publicly and give the order, the contractor must be ready to inflict the punishment, to set up the crosses, and he must offer for free nails, pitch, wax, and tapers. If he is ordered to drag off the body with a hook, a workman dressed in red will drag off the body or several bodies to the ringing of bells. In 61 BCE, a notorious crime recorded by Tacitus shocked Roman society. A household slave murdered his master, the city prefect Pedanius Secundus, either due to some argument over the price promised for manumission, or because the slave was in love with a male prostitute and could not bear having his master as a rival. Due to an ancient custom that required that the whole slave household be executed for such a crime, the people of Rome went into the streets and protested against such excessive harshness against the innocent. Despite some in the Senate speaking up against the punishment, those who insisted on the death penalty for the whole household, including women and children, won the day. However, the sentence could not be carried out due to the fact that the populace had banded together and was threatening to use rocks and burning torches. The emperor was forced to use military guards to close off the entire route along which the condemned were led to the execution. Rights and responsibilities of slaves. Roman society legally considered slaves as chattels or property, but masters Masters were not required to mark their slaves in any way to distinguish them from free people unless they had run away, although later in the empire there were some restrictions on the type of clothing they should wear. Despite being at the bottom of the social scale, slaves did have some rights, and most owners allowed their domestic slaves some measure of freedom. They could hold property. This was usually in the form of money, referred to as a peculum. The slave's pocket money technically belonged to the owner and would revert to him on a slave's death. A slave could occasionally use it to purchase a slave of his own, but more commonly the peculium was used to purchase his or her freedom or manumission. More educated slaves were able to own their own money, and were often freed in the terms of their master's will. 2. Legal rights. In the Roman Republic, a slave's testimony against the bad treatment of a master would not be accepted except in the case of torture. But in the early empire, several emperors granted slaves more legal rights. For example, Claudius ruled that any slave abandoned by his master became free. Nero granted slaves the right to complain in court for mistreatment, and during the 2nd century CE, Antonius Pius ruled that any owner killing his slave would be charged with homicide. 3. Slaves could not technically be married, although they could enter into concubinage with the legal consent of their masters. This was a form of union, valid according to a natural law, but without any legal or civil rights. The only relationship legally validated was that of a mother and child, for it was through the mother that the child was born a slave. 4. Slaves were permitted some freedom during religious festivals, such as Saturnalia, when the social order was inverted. Slaves did not have to work, were waited on at meal times, and were permitted to wear their master or mistress's clothing and to gamble. Manumission. Manumission either granted by a master, sometimes stated in a will, or purchased through a peculium, might be absolute or come with certain limitations. These might include paying the master a portion of the slave's earned assets. There were usually continuing social obligations between master and former slave. A freedman became the client of his former master. This might include campaigning on his behalf if he chose to stand for election, and carrying out other requested activities. But the patron, in his turn, would ensure the freedman's physical and material security. In some cases, the freedman took on his former master's name. Freed slaves could become citizens if they fulfilled certain conditions, but some would never become citizens even if manumitted. Those chained by their masters for punishment, branded, found guilty of a felony, or handed over to be a gladiator.